Into the night, the train creeps, with the night dragging its rigid length like a snake, hissing, wounded in the spine, moving, leaving writhing marks of Crimson Lake, Johor Bahru, Kluang, Gemas, sleeping hollows and waking grottos, morning mist, warps Seremban.
So the title was very mysterious to me. It's F.M.S.R. The author's name was Francis P. Ng.
I had never heard of Francis P. Ng before.
I have no idea who Francis P. Ng was.
It would change your narrative of the beginnings of modern poetry.
But what made the story more amazing is the events that subsequently unraveled.
So this is almost like an Indiana Jones story, you know? It's like finding the Ark of the Covenant. For some time, I've been fascinated by the idea of Singaporean writing from before independence. One day, my friend Yo Yen Ping, who used to work in the National Library, came to me to show me this book that was wrapped in a brown paper bag. And it was from the old Raffles Library archives. And that turned out to be a copy of the 1937 edition of F.M.S.R, this book-length poem. And then I got really excited by that because up until then, I didn't even know a Singaporean had published a book in London as early in the 1930s. And this book-length poem was in a closed vault, so there was no way anyone from the public would have known about it. So apparently, this is one of only 5 known copies of the book to be found in any major library anywhere.
Well, the poem is written in a variety of meters according to the poet. And it is about a trip made by someone, presumably the author himself, who takes the night train from Singapore to Kuala Lumpur and comes back. In the process, he has written a poem of 10 sections or 10 stanzas in which he ruminates about the state of Singapore and Malaysia.
There are some things that I found distinctive about F.M.S.R. At the same time, I found that this poem was written very much under the influence of T.S. Eliot and many other modernist poets. This motif of living dead was there. It has a very pessimistic take on Singapore of the 1930s, which had already suffered a lot from the Great Depression. Then I wanted to see if I can find anything about this author, Francis P. Ng.
Erico contacted me and started asking about the author of F.M.S.R. And I said, I have no idea who Francis P. Ng was. You know, it's way before my time. I only knew about the work, and that was interesting to me, but I had not done any homework on its origins. It was a complete mystery to me. And then Erico took it from there.
To see tigers and snakes in Singapore and drink tiger beers. But our tigers have grown timorous and dare not come forth to meet the amorous whimsicality of the rich visitor. So to the Pongal Zoo she goes to meet living tigers, snakes and armadillos, or dead tigers guarding garish advertisement panels, or Raffles Museum to stare at stupid animals.
When I was writing a paper about F.M.S.R, I noticed that there's a footnote to one of the sections which says that this section was published earlier in this British literary magazine, Life and Letters, Today. And I thought, okay, for my textual analysis, I should take a look at that. And I got a copy of this section which came, with the title, The Song of the Night Express. And there I found a different name, not Francis P. Ng, but Teo Poh Leng. And also the same magazine contained a brief biographical information about Teo Poh Leng. Some important pieces of information that he was born in 1912. I was very excited because now I have a different name, and I immediately typed in his name in the internet and came across a lot of articles, which are all actually in newspaper SG. Well, some of the things that I learned from these articles were that he studied at Raffles College. And before that, he went to St. Joseph's Institution. In the Catholic community, he was very active. And the NUS librarian, Tim Yap Phuan, I asked him if he could find any publications by Teo Poh Leng, which appeared in Raffles College magazine. I decided to go to Singapore to make sure that I hadn't missed anything. Ultimately, I think that we have to look at everything with our own eyes. I was pregnant when I found the name Teo Poh Leng. So that was a situation which made it difficult for me to make a trip there. So I had to bring my entire family so that someone could take care of the baby while I was doing research. Actually, I wanted to go to Singapore to make sure that I have done everything. And if I couldn't find anything, then I know that I have to give up this research. Teo Poh Leng was a member of Teachers Association magazine, Chorus. Until the end of my trip, I didn't actually come across any important information. But in this magazine, the last issue, which I think came out in 1941, I found his poem. So it seemed like his latest poem was The Spider. I felt like, oh my god, okay, this was in the last issue of the magazine, which was actually going through only like 2 days before my return to Germany. So by finding this poem, I felt like I should keep going on instead of giving up.
Teo Poh Leng was born in 1912. He studied in St. Joseph's Institution and later Raffles College, where he graduated with a liberal arts degree in 1934. After that, he began working as a teacher. His first poem, Time is Past, was published in 1936 in the literary journal The London Mercury. In 1937, he published the poem The Song of the Night Express, which later that year was turned into a book-length poem titled F.M.S.R, written under the pen name Francis P. Ng. He was mentioned several times in the local papers, and his last known poem, The Spider, came out in the 1941 issue of the magazine Chorus. On December 8, 1941, the Japanese invasion of Malaya began. Japanese troops landed in Kotabaru and advanced south. The British surrendered in February 1942, which led to 3.5 years of the Japanese occupation. Around that time, Teo Poh Leng disappeared. Night is here again, gloating, triumphant. Undertaker stalking the plain. Bury the living dead, bury the dying lives. Bury and bury and bury. Hurry and hurry and hurry. Feet are heard to scurry, scurry like busy wives. Bidadari garden bed. Bury at night by electric light, burning the night. Lengthening shadows of darkening forms, beckoning sorrows, wriggling with worms.
I found a lot about Teo Poh Leng, but then at this point, I already knew that he somehow disappeared before the Japanese occupation of Singapore. All his publications, like newspaper articles which mention his name, they were there until like 1939, 1940. And after that, I couldn't find any articles with his name and no information about his whereabouts after the war. According to the register, which was published in the 1960s. Yeah, he had been missing. The next thing I had to do was ask this question to the larger Singapore public. And for that purpose, I had to publish my findings. And then the question was where I should get my things published. Turned out that BiblioAsia would give me the perfect platform.
I had an email out of the blue from Erico expressing the idea of writing a story on Francis P. Ng, a fairly obscure poet that very few people in Singapore outside of academia would have heard of. Now, the first thought that crossed my mind was, why would a Japanese lecturer in American studies teaching in a German university want to write the story about a Singapore poet? But the idea was an intriguing one, and as I thought about it, I actually got quite excited, right? So I said, Erico, go ahead and write it.
I was very lucky that I could learn about BiblioAsia, which concentrated a lot on narrating stories through visual means. Francis Dorai, the editor of BiblioAsia, reached out to the Straits Times to see if they could write an article and ask their readers if they had heard of Teo Poh Leng.
So what happened was, I had a call from the arts correspondent of the Straits Times, and this was Akshita Nanda. And she said, hey Francis, we want to run the story on this, and could you put me in touch with the author, Erico?
She also wrote an article about my research with this wonderful title, Do You Know Teo Poh Leng? Samuel Chia, a Straits Times reader, wrote to Akshita and to tell her that he guesses that Teo Poh Leng was maybe a brother of former school teacher Teo Ka Leng, whom he knew indirectly because this Ka Leng wrote a poem titled I Found a Bone, and this poem was about him losing his brothers. And then he said in this first email that this poem was about Peter and Paul. The brothers' names were Peter and Paul. By getting this piece of information, I immediately knew that Samuel was right because Teo Poh Leng's Christian name was Paul.
When I first read I Found a Bone, I was tremendously moved. Here appears to be an imaginative reconstruction of a brother who survived the war and realized that his two brothers, Peter and Paul, did not. And so he wrote about it. The bone became a sort of a metaphor for his discovery of the death of his brothers in the Sukching massacre of February 1942. So how moving can that be?
I found a bone on Pongal Beach, half buried in the sand, and bleached as white by the sea and sun. I picked it with my hand. It was as brittle and as light as coral in the sea. It once had been an arm like mine and had a hope like me.
I was shocked to find this piece of information that I had not expected to find in a poem. And namely, I found when exactly he was killed. So this poem says he was killed by this massacre which took place on the 28th of February. Yeah, this is the kind of information I had been looking for by trying to access all so-called official records. It was a big surprise and shock to me that I ended up finding this piece of information in a literary work. So now I found out that the school teacher Teo Poh Leng was a brother of Teo Poh Leng. But I had to find out if I could get in touch with his family members.
How did I get in touch with Erico? The only people that would know would be my generation. So she actually called me and asked me. I agreed to look into it, and then that's when I started, deciphering the book name and the pseudonym, and I had to find out a little bit more. Okay, so I went around to ask my relatives to try and do the connection. They did know him as Francis, but I never knew him as Francis. Because to me he was always Paul, Teo Poh Leng. When I asked them about the Francis, they said that, it's his confirmation name, because as Catholics, usually when you are confirmed, you take on a second name. So he decided to use Francis as his first name and Paul as his second name, and then using my grandmother's maiden name. When I first read F.M.S.R, I had a very eerie feeling, because when I went through and I was reading about places that my dad had often talked about, the first similarity that I came across when I was reading F.M.S.R was Punggol Zoo. And I remembered my father also mentioned Punggol Zoo in one of his poems. And Punggol Zoo was a place that they often went when they were kids, And then there were words, very archaic words that were used, like pock-pitted, yeah. So that word really hit me. The minute I saw that word in my uncle's poem, I said, it has to be the same, like similar kind of thoughts. I was convinced that they were works of two brothers that were very close to one another. Yeah. And it was only when I was very, very certain that I dared to write to Erico. And it so happened that it was on the 28th of February, the date that my uncles were killed,
Yeah, I got an email from Anne, and she confirmed that Teo Poh Leng was her uncle. Had never thought that this would happen. I had such a difficult time looking for people who had known Teo Poh Leng.
Paul Teo Poh Leng had 6 sisters and 2 brothers. His father was a Mandarin teacher, while his mother was a housewife. His second brother, Benedict Teo Poh Leng, was 3 years older. They both studied at Holy Innocent School and later at St. Joseph's Institution. On completing their education, they joined their oldest brother, Peter Teo Poh Leng, and became teachers. After the fall of Singapore in February 1942, Poh Leng and Poh Leng were rounded up and subsequently killed on Punggol Beach. They were among the thousands of victims of what history remembers as the Suk Ching Massacre. Poh Leng, who was away during the call-up, narrowly escaped the purge and survived the war. Years later, he wrote about the deaths of his 2 brothers in his poem, I Found a Bone. He would eventually rise up to become the principal of Montfort Primary School before retiring in 1969. He died in 2001 at the age of 92. I heard my brother groan and die. I heard approaching feet. And I felt the welcome steel that stopped my heart to beat. I held the arm bone in my hand and let my warm tears fall my brothers were slain on Pongal Beach. My brothers, Peter and Paul.
So from her, I learned that Teo Poh Leng also wrote a lot of poems. And actually even tried to publish his own poetry collection in the 1960s. And showed me this manuscript full of poems that she inherited from him. But then now we said, okay, we have this manuscript and let's try to make his dream come true. So we republished F.M.S.R. and other poems by Teo Poh Leng in 2015 under the title Finding Francis. And in the following year, in 2016, we published Teo Poh Leng's poetry collection under the title I Found the Bone. I felt good that I could finally make this poem much more accessible to Singaporean readers.
Yeah, I'm just glad that it's all done, and it's also good for Singapore and Singaporeans to know their history and their past. I mean, this is something we should not forget. And we learn from the past. I think it's a good chapter of my life that I have accomplished. Yeah.
When you become aware that the poem was published as far back as 1937, it would change your narrative of the beginnings of modern poetry. But I want to make an important point here that has not been made. It is important to realize that it was not mentioned or discovered till 2015. So during that period, nobody knew about the existence of this important poem. If Teo Poh Leng had survived the war and had continued to write, I think he would have been enormously influential. It's in hindsight, looking back, that we are saying if we want to trace the history of English writing in Singapore and Malaysia, we have to go back to Teo Poh Leng.
So I think it's very important for us to remember that there was life before independence. There is a lot of good and at least interesting writing by people who were from Singapore, who lived here, who wrote about their life and their times. F.M.S.R. is one such example. And the thing about F.M.S.R. that I think is quite special is that it was a book-length poem, right? There was an attempt to really think about our place in a very interesting way, using the railway as a kind of an extended metaphor. And the thing is, up until I came across that book, I had no idea anyone was doing that as early as 1930s. It makes you wonder, what else is out there to be rediscovered?